Dr. Emily Kittle is an associate professor of Latin American history at the University of Calgary in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Dr. Kittle specializes in political and cultural history of Mexican foreign relations and received the inaugural Sir Isaac Walton Killam SSHRC Emerging Research Leader Award from the University of Calgary in 2014. She has published articles in the Journal of Latin American Studies, ESTOR, the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Latin American History, and the Mexican Studies Journal. She co-edited with Maria Munoz the publication Populism in 20th Century Mexico, which was published by the University of Arizona Press in 2010. Her first monograph, Mexico's Relations with Latin America during the Cardenas era, based on her University of Arizona doctoral dissertation, was published by the University of New Mexico Press in 2016. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. Kittle.
Okay, thanks very much. I hope you can hear me. And there's a little bit of an issue with the slideshow that you can see the next slide coming. That's okay. It will just give you a preview of what's to come. First of all, I wanted to say thank you so much for welcoming me today. I'm speaking with you from Calgary, Canada, where today postal workers with Canada Post went out on strike. So, this might be something for discussion, or you might have time later in your discussions to talk about how postal services for the blind show how national postal services cannot be considered businesses because they have obligations to serve their communities in ways that private delivery services do not. So just of interest, given the topic of my paper. But anyway, I'll get to the topic at hand. So by way of introduction, the symbol of the black on white stick figure holding a cane with a small image of a white envelope in the upper right-hand corner of the sticker is the international secogram symbol, which allows items to be conveyed through the post without charge, and is recognized by letter carriers and post office officials the world over. For individuals who are blind or visually impaired, the post continues to serve as a lifeline, enabling access to information. Even in the modern era of new media, and since the 2012 UPU Doha Congress, which extended the exemption from postal charges to a wider range of items for the blind, today, more than 285 million individuals who are blind and visually impaired worldwide can produce and consume information thanks to the foresight of the Universal Postal Union, whose members agreed at the Brussels Congress of 1952, that literature for the blind should be exempt from postal duties. And although this may seem to have been a charitable decision on the part of postal officials worldwide, this paper shows that a long process of negotiation both preceded and followed this landmark decision. So to give you a little bit of an idea about the research context for this paper, I wanted to acknowledge that I do feel like a little bit of an interloper because I'm not a postal history specialist or a philatelist or even a disability history specialist. Rather, I'm an historian of international relations. But the story for this research project for me began more than 25 years ago or thereabouts, when I was fresh out of undergrad and I served for a year as a research assistant for the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, and the president at the time, Euclid Harry. And I was his research assistant for his book, Journey to Independence, Blindness, the Canadian Story. And also, I served in as a sighted guide and interpreter for him at a couple of different congresses. One, the Latin American Union of the Blind, and another, the meeting of the World Blind Union, which was held in Havana, because I speak Spanish and could serve as his sighted guide. And in my time researching this project, and also especially at the international congresses that I attended, I saw the level of importance that members of the World Blind Union, but also individuals who were blind and partially sighted or visually impaired, placed on the significance of the Universal Postal Union's extension of franking privileges. And so this just remained as an experience in the back of my mind for many years. I went on to become a professor of international relations and Latin American international relations in particular. Um, but I continued to think about the significance of this international multilateral organization, the Universal Postal Union, and the ways in which negotiations at the UPU had laid the groundwork for important benefits for individuals um, with blindness or visual impairments worldwide. So it was really interesting to me that when I received an internal grant and um, was able to go and do some research at the Universal Postal Union just this past June. The first thing that I found in my research there was a recent article from 2001 from the magazine, the UPU's magazine Union Postal, on this very issue. And this here is an image of Dr. Harry, who was the president of the CNIB and the president of the World Blind Union. And this article describes the significance of this concession for the World Blind Union and individuals worldwide. So that's the research context for this project. And what I argue in the paper upon which this summary is based is that the principle of access to information became a defining aspect of ideas of disability through the agency of blind and visually impaired postal users, as well as the organizations of and for the blind who serve them, and through the negotiations between members of the Universal Postal Union. So that's the overarching argument that I'm hoping to make in this paper, but then also in the larger research project of which this is a part. Um, and so to give you a little bit of an idea of the historiography or the literature on this subject, there are histories of blindness in various countries. Um, and one outstanding example of history of postal services for the blind in the UK. But generally, this has not been a major topic of concern for postal history. Nor has it been a major topic of concern for international relations history, the negotiations at the Universal Postal Union, and then even less so how disability history intersected with the history of the multilateral organization. So there is emerging literature on disability history, but very little on the kind of transnational history of blindness and postal services for the blind. So what were some of the sources that I used in researching this project? Um, so first, I showed you the image of the magazine Union Postal, which is the major magazine of the UPU. And that was a great source for this project, as well as other periodical sources, articles in newspapers over the world, locations of different postal congresses. But then also the acts of the congresses themselves. And here is an image of the acts of the Brussels Congress in 1952, where this landmark decision was taken. But then also archival sources at the Universal Postal Union. So I'd like to particularly thank Anna Bazzelli for putting me in touch with the UPU librarian and archivist Solange Avila, who was so welcoming and helpful during my stay in Bern and in the course of my consultations at the archive of the UPU. Naturally, I found the best sources on the last day that I was there, and this is an image of one of the folders that I'll be referring to in my discussion. These documents include correspondence between member countries and the International Bureau of the UPU, and they're held in Bern at the headquarters. So what exactly happened? Just to get into some of the nuts and bolts and the details. So the horizontal structure of the Universal Postal Union enables delegates from countries around the world to participate on equal footing in one of the world's oldest multilateral institutions. And because of this structure, initiatives for change derived not only from technological advances in, postal services and all kinds of postal carriers and things like that, but also from the individual proposals of delegates from and the countries that they represented. In the case of the franking exemption for Matter for the Blind, um, considerable consensus emerged the world over that the bulky nature of materials for the blind placed an undue burden on organizations of and for the blind and their clients, just because they were so big and bulky that it made it prohibitively expensive to send them through the post. However, different postal regimes emerged to address this burden in different national contexts. So then once together at the Universal Postal Union, it took several decades to determine the best way to express this general desire to alleviate this burden in a way that satisfied the postal requirements of different countries worldwide, and in a way that could adapt to technological advances that occurred in making information accessible to individuals who were blind or visually impaired over the course of the 20th century. So the main points of debate in these deliberations over the course of many years at the UPU, and the ones that I identify in particular at the Brussels Congress and the following Congress, which occurred in Ottawa, Canada in 1957. The main points of debate that I identify are first, whether the franking exemption should include personal correspondence or only literature, so Braille books and other types of publications or printed matter. Second, how this idea or the definition of printed matter should be defined, given first the early diversity of different writing systems in use by blind individuals in different regional and national contexts, but then also eventually the development of new media, such as embossed photographs, sound recordings, and all kinds of other things, films, etc. And then the final issue, which didn't really receive much debate, but which I trace in the acts of the various congresses, was the fact that there was a stipulation that matter for the blind should be posted open. So in containers, envelopes, things that could be opened for inspection to ensure that the benefit was not being, as they said at the time, abused. So these are some of the issues that I identify at these congresses. And these three debates or these three issues that I examine crystallized at the 1952 Brussels Congress. Postal services for the blind were one of many issues treated at this Congress, which lasted 2 months and modernized many aspects of the international postal system. The Congress was celebrated at the time by the UPU for the sheer number of countries represented and also for the number of proposals that were presented at the Congress. The UPU's executive regulations, the convention, and a number of its articles were revised by delegates at the meeting. And one of the many outstanding outcomes of the Congress was the establishment of free postal services for the blind among all of the member countries. It's important to point out, I think, that the international system of nations had changed significantly since the Second World War. And some of the articles at Brussels also reflected the emergence of other international organizations, such as the United Nations, UNESCO, the WHO. But the UPU's magazine, Union Postal, referred to Brussels as the Congress of Redrafted Acts. So there was definitely a kind of changing of the guard that took place in Brussels that dealt with a significant modernization of the mechanisms of the UPU. And these changes were debated and achieved through changes to the convention and its articles. The Congress lasted a full 2 months, and the work for its preparation began much earlier, almost as soon as the previous Congress in Paris in 1947 chose Brussels as the next host. So how did it work? What was the mechanism by which these changes occurred? Member countries submitted proposals for the review of other delegates in advance of the Congress, and the work of the Congress was divided into 8 committees. The General Committee dealt with problems affecting the Union as a whole, such as its relations with the United Nations. And then the first committee was dedicated to technical issues related to the letter post. Its work was so abundant that it was necessary to establish a deliberative subcommittee to discuss issues and prepare resolutions for the first committee. And it was these committees, the first committee and then the deliberative subcommittee, where the question of free postal services for the blind were deliberated. So agreement on this proposal, the idea for free postal services for the blind was broad-based, but debate did occur. And it's interesting to note that UNESCO's director wrote a letter of support to the UPU's International Bureau, which was then communicated to the delegates. He wrote in favor of modifications to the convention that furthered the free exchange of information, which supported UNESCO's mission. So annexed to the letter of support were summaries of UNESCO's position on various proposals that had been pre-circulated for adoption at the Congress. And these ranged from discounted duties on newspapers and educational films to free postage for letters posted by prisoners of war, as well as free postage for the blind. He argued that these proposals, all of these proposals, would contribute to mutual comprehension or mutual understanding, and that being one of the fundamental essentials for world peace. So he submitted this brief in support of these documents, these proposals. Then during the debates, the government of Japan, nevertheless, despite the broad-based kind of support for the idea, the government of Japan proposed an addition to the final protocol of the convention, an article stipulating that governments that did not have local legislation providing the franking exemption could nevertheless assess duty. So the delegate from Japan said he didn't want countries to not ratify the convention because their local legislation didn't permit this service. So he didn't want to hold up the ratification of the convention, he argued. And he explained that it would be necessary to introduce this additional article so that other countries, Japan and other countries, would be able to pass the convention. And this proposal was adopted. So with this provision in place, the final text of the Article 38 of the Convention of the 1952 Congress read that impressions, and I'm loosely translating from the French, relief impressions for the use of the blind are exempt from all postal taxes. So that was the landmark decision in 1952, but that was not the end of the matter by any means. So after the historic Brussels Congress, and in preparation for the next Congress, which was to be held at Ottawa in 1957, and desirous of applying the principle of free postage for the blind within their own realm, the Swedish government wrote to the International Bureau to ask that the member states of the UPU share information on how these services were being applied in their own countries. The Swedish government observed that in some places, all postal services for the blind were exempt from all duties, whereas in other places, only regular surface mail was going through the post free, and instead a number of charges for things like express mail or registration, all of those came with a cost. So in the months that followed, member countries responded to the Swedish request for information, and these letters were announced in the Circulaire du Bureau International. So In one typical response, the South African Postmaster General wrote to the director of the International Bureau, sharing that in his jurisdiction, um, quote, literature for the blind posted in the Union of South Africa is exempted from postage only, end quote. So in this case, registered mail, COD service, express mail, and other supplementary charges must be paid by the senders. But he did go on to note that the South African Postal Service included in the definition of literature for the blind many other articles that this term came to include, such as metal plates impressed for the use of the blind, sound records, and also special paper intended solely for the use of the blind. With the proviso that, quote, they are sent by or addressed to recognized institutions for the blind. So this did not include personal correspondence. The Belgian government, by contrast, took a different view, stating that in their administration considered that it was the intention of the Brussels Congress to exempt all charges from matter posted for the blind, including COD and express charges, etc. And the the Belgian government stated that prisoners of war, as well as the blind, had been accorded the franking exemption at Brussels. And the Director General of the Postal Administration of Belgium cited the acts of the Brussels Congress in support of his government's position that both should be dispatched free of all taxes and service fees. It seems, however, that this position was not widely held. As could be expected from their interventions at Brussels, the Japanese government responded that in their case, they had the exemption from the Congress, from the convention, and that this was Article 2 of the final protocol of the convention. And they did not give free postal services for the blind, but they still said that in their understanding, it had been the intention of the Congress at Brussels and the members there, delegates there, to include literature of the blind and correspondence of prisoners of war as being exonerated from all postal taxes. They argued that unless a government employed the exemption under Article 2, like theirs did, matter for the blind and prisoners of war should be exempt from all taxes. The Postmaster General and Director of Telecommunications of Ceylon responded that literature for the blind to or from any institution for the deaf and blind, quote, approved by the Postmaster General, end quote, passes free in international post. Quote, in spite of the option provided in Article 2 of the final protocol. And they stated that taking into consideration that the fact that the exemption for the blind was adopted by a large majority at the Brussels Congress, and that UNESCO had been keen in this concession being granted, they were going ahead and providing these services. The report suggested that Ceylon did not yet have local legislation regarding the franking exemption, but it was nevertheless allowing internationally posted matter for the blind to be delivered free of duties that it could have assessed if it had used the second article of the protocol. And I think it's also interesting that Ceylon's comment that this article had been of particular interest to UNESCO also bears underscoring. So although the Director General of UNESCO's communications to the delegates had been, in my reading, quite vague and in support of all kinds of articles that extended communication worldwide. Um, the um, the delegate from Ceylon was under the impression that they had particularly supported this exemption, and so this helps me to interpret the UNESCO contribution to the Congress in Brussels. Um, so several governments had to change their legislation in order to comply with with the provisions of the UPU Convention. Um, and in particular, the S.H. Eaton of the General Post Office in Great Britain wrote to the director of the International Bureau of the UPU to say that their government interpreted Article 38 of the convention as meaning that literature was only exempted from the prepayment of surface postage, but not charges for registration, express delivery, etc. And he added that, quote, "It is the experience of this administration that posters of blind literature very rarely, if ever, use any of the supplementary services mentioned in the foregoing paragraph." Um, so he considered it a moot point, and maybe that was true, but the fact remained that there was considerable disagreement about how best to implement Article 38 of the convention, and this guaranteed that it would also be a question on the agenda in Ottawa in 1957. So So here's an image from the Ottawa Congress in 1957, which was held August 14th to October 3rd. And at this Congress, the members of the UPU embraced technological change and the modernization of postal methods, which in the magazine here said, quote, "New and better means are every day placed at the disposal of men and services, and the Postal Service, in order to fulfill its age-old role, naturally feels that it must follow this evolution," end quote. So the Congress considered a wide variety of improvements of postal service, including debating this question once again of whether printed matter or matter for the blind should include correspondence in addition to literature and other articles for the blind. Um, okay, so following up on the correspondence that was exchanged with the International Bureau and the UPU, between the Brussels and Ottawa meetings. The delegation from Belgium pre-circulated a proposal number 14, which contemplated modifying Article 38 to clarify that matter for the blind is exempt from franking taxes, as well as special fees related to express post and that kind of thing. And this amendment passed. So a sufficient number of countries believed that the original intention had been for all fees to be exempt, and the amendment passed. But furthermore, it was argued that this should be expanded to include correspondence, not just literature for the blind or other articles. So at the Ottawa Congress, in a pre-circulated proposal, the Italian delegate suggested that the principle of the assimilation of letters in Braille, and the original proposal said lettres Braille, um, uh, in use for the blind, which they said had been affirmed at the Postal Congress in Buenos Aires in 1939, should also be included in the convention and its changes contemplated at Ottawa. But it did say so long as those letters or that correspondence be as long as it's posted open. So meaning that it could be examined by postal authorities. There was an amendment to the Italian proposal, which was from Great Britain, because they noted that the wording of the original proposal only mentioned Braille and not other writing systems. And so this was an amendment to the Italian proposal, which went through, and the Italian government accepted the friendly amendment. And so they said that henceforth, correspondence, in addition to literature for the blind and other matter for the blind, would be included in the franking exemption. So this was the second part to the landmark decision of 1952. In 1957, it is extended to include correspondence. And I argue that this represents a fulfillment of the concept of access to information. However, this was, I think, tempered by the fact that that correspondence as well as literature for the blind had to be posted open or déposé ouvert in the original term. Okay, so what were some of the main debates? I think there are three related issues: technological change, the distinction between literature and correspondence, which I've mentioned, and then the privacy issue. Although the technology employed in the creation of materials for the blind evolved from the 19th through the 21st centuries, this early distinction between materials produced by organizations of and for the blind, including Braille books and other printed materials, and correspondence written using an embossed system of writing, was reflected in the international sphere. And it also presents, I think, an important distinction between accessibility of information produced by others and the ability of blind and partially sighted individuals to also disseminate information or create information. Access to information does not only involve being able to consume information, but also being able to produce it. So this tension has been important to the evolution of the definition of access to information for blind and visually impaired individuals since the 19th century. And I think an important part of this evolution of the definition took place at the UPU. So the early history of printing for the blind was characterized by innovation and diversity. For many decades, several different typescripts and systems of writing coexisted. And the increase in communication between individuals and also organizations of and for the blind who had previously been more isolated in different regional and national contexts contributed to the need for standardization of writing systems. But this remained a fraught process for many, many decades with boosters of one system or another, and also literates of one system or another vying for supremacy. And so it was many years before the tactile system of writing invented by Louis Braille in France in 1845 what became kind of the preeminent system of writing. So it's interesting to note that the first reference to literature for the blind um, demonstrates an attention to this early diversity of writing systems. So in the first instance, these materials were simply referred to as relief impressions for the use of the blind. And this first instance, it comes from the UPU Congress of 1878 at Paris, where the convention regulated printed matter of all nature. And so the argument was, what is printed matter? Do do things written in Braille or other relief systems constitute printed matter? And as early as 1885 in Lisbon, at that Congress, the French delegation to the UPU Congress initially asked that the definition of printed matter be expanded to include impressions, relief impressions for the use of the blind. And at that Congress, Germany spoke in favor of the amendment. But they said, as long as that does not include personal correspondence. So even from 1885 at Lisbon, there's this tension between printed matter and correspondence. So the final text of the Lisbon Congress read, so printed matter in relief points for the use of the blind. So this debate pertained to whether Braille should be conveyed according to the same provisions as other printed matter, such as sheet music or carte de visite, all of which were also debated at the same meeting. But this definition excluded other systems of embossed reading, such as moon type, pictured here in this slide, or also other types like embossed letters. But at the 1906 UPU Congress in Rome, the representative from the Netherlands proposed that the language be replaced with points or letters, relief letters. So this does reflect this early diversity of systems, but then it also reflects the evolution of materials for the blind and correspondence produced by blind and visually impaired individuals. So this definition of what constituted printed matter continued to evolve over the 20th century. And the definition was once again broadened at Buenos Aires in 1939, as I'd already mentioned, when photographs bearing signs of psychography were considered to be relief prints for the use of the blind. And it's interesting to note that it was the delegation from Hungary at this meeting that proposed this change, noting that they had been specifically asked to make the proposal by a society for the blind in their own country, who argued that it would facilitate international cooperation among diverse associations for the blind and blind individuals. So as time went on, the definition of what constituted printed matter expanded to include sound recordings. But in this instance, when the definition expanded to include a different technology, it, for the first time, said that that these had to be sent by to or from an institution for the blind. So this issue of correspondence versus literature or other printed matter surfaced in this instance as well. Okay. So the by way of conclusion, the expansion of definition of the definition of matter for the blind continued to evolve in the coming decades. The neologism secogram or secogram evolved from the first reference to photographs bearing signs of psychography and continued to expand to include articles for the blind, such as cassette recordings, CDs, etc. And by the 2012 Doha UPU Congress, the wording of the convention changed from secograms to mention items for the blind. This acknowledged the increasingly expansive use of the term, which now includes things like white canes or other assistive technology for the use of the blind, as well as correspondence and literature. But interestingly, the one caveat that continues from these very early debates is the stipulation that items must be posted open, ready for inspection, as Great Britain had argued in 1939 at Buenos Aires to, quote, prevent abuse. So although the reusable Velcro or zipper close envelopes that libraries for the blind use today are practical in that they are reusable and sturdy, consideration of the origins of this packaging are worth considering. So what other population regularly expects the privacy of the post to be surveilled in this way or violated in this way? And in many countries, I would say that the development of postal services was central to the development of the idea of privacy. And yet, subject to suspicion of abuse of the privileges granted to them, organizations for the blind and their clients do not benefit from this principle. So I realize that I'm almost out of time. So I was going to mention some future directions of this project, but I think I would rather conclude here and open the floor to questions if there are any. And I'm happy to talk about future directions of the project or any other aspects of what I've discussed. And I thank you all for your attention, and thank you once again for this opportunity to kind of be an interloper into your world.
We do have a short bit of time for a couple of questions, if there are any. Yes. The question was, the person was wondering if there was any debate about the definition of what blind is.
That's interesting. Yeah, no, I have not, at least in my preliminary research, I have not seen that at all. And it is interesting to note that there are different definitions in different countries, right? So where you are in the United States, it says for blind and quote handicapped people is what would appear on a letter. So there's a wider definition. It could be for those who have other disabilities as well. But I've not seen that debated at all in the references that I've come across at the UPU.